Hello there, this is Scott with Hi-Lux Optics. Today I wanted to take a chance to talk with you all about how these four scopes, and the parts commonly found attached to them, may be interchangeable. Most of them are interchangeable, but may require small adaptations in order to actually be usable when attached to your rifle. Let's start with naming all the pieces here, and then break into how the different combinations will function on the different scopes for different scenarios. All four of these scopes are part of what we call the Malcolm line. All four of them are 3/4 inch tubes. We're talking about the diameter of this part right here, and this scope not including the objective bell. This is the newer Malcolm 6-power two-tone scope. This is the 3-power older Malcolm scope. This is the 6-power Malcolm scope. And this is the Unertl 8-power reproduction that we also call the USMC sniper. These two scopes may seem pretty similar, aside from the cap that I've removed over here, and their only real difference is about 1 inch in length and a doubling of the magnification. Otherwise, these two scopes are typically found with the exact same parts right out of the kit. But again, many of these will fit over here, and we'll be going over that in a bit. This is the newer competition mounts, often found with the Unertl style scope, and used in CMP competitions. This is the newer Malcolm clickless mount that is found in the kit with our 6-power Malcolm two-tone scope. This is the older Lyman style mount found with the Unertl 8-power scope. And this is the older clickless Malcolm mount used often with these two black 3-power and 6-power scopes. Around here you'll see a few parts that I've let loose just because I had to remove them while setting up for this video, and well, I'll be reinstalling them later anyway, so let's leave them there. Okay. These three parts are locking rings that are typically used on these three Malcolm scopes, and I'll explain why we don't typically use them on this fourth one. These two are front rings. This one is typically used to help the scope slide under recoil, and is going to be found on our Unertl and our newer two-tone 6-power scope. This typically does not allow sliding, but we'll go over how that can be changed, and is often found on either of these older Malcolm scopes. These two locking rings look remarkably similar, but the different widths of the tangs here help them fit to these two different front mounts for different situations. These are parts of eyepieces for the different scopes that again I had to remove for setting up in this video, and rather than having to thread this whole thing on over and over, I'll just do that later. All of these are blocks that are used in different situations to attach any of these 6 rings to your rifle. Often they will be attached to the barrel, but some can be attached to the receiver. We'll be going over which are commonly used where later on in this video. This right here is a recoil spring. It helps return your scope to battery when you need your scope to slide. Often, this spring is attached to the Unertl scope when it is used outside of competition. Give me a moment to clear the board and let's get started. Let's start with the question I get asked most often. How do these older style scopes work with these rings and these weird block looking things to fix this scope onto the rifle and, well, make it usable? You may be familiar with the more modern setup of the Picatinny rail. Onto that, as you're familiar with, the ring gets attached and the scope tube itself goes into the rings. The main difference is that these older scopes are basically telescopes. They don't really have any adjustment control in them. All of the elevation, the windage, that's all found in the ring itself, and it pushes this scope tube up and down around inside this cage. This part down here is called a plunger, and it's held in place by a spring that keeps pressure against the turrets and the scope tube. These rings need to be attached to the rifle, and much like the Picatinny rail that you're familiar with, it will attach to your rifle at a standard sort of space. We call these blocks. Blocks come in a few varieties to handle a few different mounting situations, just like your Picatinny rail might have a different length or a different height. For example, some of these will have a curved bottom. That's to help it fit to a round barrel. This one is a little bit broader of a curve. These two blocks are typically used to fix any of the rings to a 1903 rifle. And these are other versions of these two-sided blocks. We have one here that's flat on the bottom for an octagonal barrel, another flat here, and this is a shorter version of this same round-bottomed. Now you may be wondering why some of these blocks are standing up and others are not. It's because they keep falling over. I'll have a bloopers reel at the end of this video, but don't worry, they're basically dominoes. These blocks, as I mentioned earlier, are attached typically directly to the barrel or the receiver. If you already have holes drilled in the barrel or the receiver, try and measure the distance between them to see whether or not our pre-drilled holes will fit yours. If they don't worry, we do have blank blocks with no holes drilled so that you can drill them to the exact distance that you need. If you have any other questions, I recommend getting in touch with your gunsmith. I have no doubt that they have plenty of different screws and measuring devices available. Once these blocks are attached to the barrel, these rings slide onto the blocks and lock in place with a crossbolt. This is not far off from the crossbolt that attaches onto the Picatinny rail. The main difference between these blocks and Picatinny rails is that there are two different kinds of crossbolts, one of which is going to be in your ring. Your ring may have a crescent bolt, named because it's sort of bowl-shaped and fits onto the crescent here on the block. Crescent fits in right in there. On the other hand, a Posa-cut has a more squared-off end of the shank, and it fits into this more squared-off divot in the center of the block. If you're trying to figure out which one you have, just go ahead and tighten the crossbolt in the bottom of your ring and take a look. It should be pretty easy to see whether or not the end is flat or shaped like a bowl. For example, this ring, and I'm not certain right now if this is coming out in video, it has a crescent ending, which means it needs to attach to the crescent side. And there we go. Please don't try to mix up which of the crossbolts you have. Don't try and force a crescent into the Posa-cut, and don't try to snap off the end of the crescent with a Posa-cut crossbolt. Typically our blocks have either side, so if you find out that you have one crossbolt or the other, you can simply turn it around. And similarly, if you decide to install your ring facing the other direction, you can just turn this around to fit which end your crossbolt is on. It's actually really that simple. So we'll move on from these blocks and get into the front ring. Next up, we have the front rings, and this is where things start to get a little weird. You may notice that the major difference is that this has a weird little hat on top, and this has a spring sort of thing in the bottom with this loose cat piece sitting off to the side. Both of these will fit a 3/4 inch tube. However, this is the only front ring that will fit the Unertl style scope. And this is probably a good time to mention that some of these older vintage scopes are meant to move under recoil. Now, a modern scope moving is typically seen as a bad thing, and the first thing that you should do is check to make sure that your rings are properly tightened. However, these older scopes often had a flimsier sort of reticle, perhaps it might have been made out of human hair or spider silk, and recoil over time would have absolutely broken it. So they were designed with the ability to slide every time the rifle was fired, after which point you would pull it back into place, a position known as battery. The Unertl scope has a rib built into it known as a pope rib, onto which this plunger acts as a guide. That little tooth fits onto this little rail, and, as you might imagine, it just slides back and forth. Whoop. And, as you might also imagine, it's held in just by spring pressure. So as long as it's on the scope tube itself, it's not going to fall off like it did just now. And let's take a moment to harken back to the previous segment. These cross bolts are different. This is a posa cut cross bolt, and this is a crescent. This typically goes on the 1903 rifle with the Unertl style scope, so it uses these odd-looking blocks that only have the crescent cut. But once again, your own rings might be a little different, so please take a moment to take a look and figure it out. I'm going to go ahead now and put both of these onto scope tubes so you can see what that process is like. At the same time, I'm going to be going over these unusual locking rings and what they do on the scope body as well. We'll start with the older Malcolm short scopes. This one is a 3-power, but we also have a 6-power that functions in just the same way. Actually, this is the Malcolm 6-power short telescope. It's about 18 inches long, weighs about 18 ounces with the rings and mounts attached, and has a 3/4 inch main diameter, as we talked about earlier. In order to put the rings on, we're going to need to take off the eyepiece and the eyepiece locking ring. Now, everything that you need can just be slid on or slid off at your own leisure. We're going to start with the front ring that is typically found with this scope in the kit. And let's make sure that this little plunger is actually on the spring. There we go. Down in here, you'll notice a trough. That trough is where you fit the tang of this locking collar. This collar, combined with this front ring, keeps the tube from moving under recoil. This is the setup you would use if you don't want the scope to move. Now, unlike modern rings, which tighten down onto the scope tube and hold it firm onto the rail, these older scopes need to be kept separate. The rear ring still moves the scope up or down, so this needs to act as a pivot point that allows the scope to move without bending it. That's why this little plunger keeps the scope tube pressed up against here, while this merely has the job of preventing it from sliding. Both have to work together. In order to attach them to the scope tube, we need to put the locking ring through and hold it in place. Otherwise, one will not be able to fit over the other when they're already on the tube. There we go. Hold that in place, and you can now slide both onto the tube. Once you have your blocks on your rifle and you have the front and rear rings on your scope tube, go ahead and leave this loose so that you can set your eye relief and level out your reticle. Once everything's in the right place, simply tighten up this screw and it'll lock where it is that you have this set. At that point, you won't be able to move the scope tube. For now, however, I'm going to remove these so that we can talk about a slight change to this front ring. This front ring can be made to slide, much like the Unertl style scope, to help your scope survive the higher recoil of a, let's say, 45-70 rifle. In order to do that, you just need one of these sliding locking rings that has the tang the right width to fit in this trough. It's going to be the same width as on this locking collar. The only difference is the length allows the scope to move. That fits in the same way. And you need to push the plunger down to make sure it doesn't bounce out on you. One point to keep in mind: when you fire, the scope will move forward. Well, actually, the rifle will move backwards and the scope will stay in place, but it'll look like the scope is moving forward. After each shot, you're going to need to pull the scope back into battery position to make sure your eye relief is just the same. Because of that, I like to have this portion of the sliding locking ring in front of the front mount. Every time that I pull the scope back, I like having this broad surface connecting with this front ring to make sure it's a repeatable return. You could put this end of the tang in front of the front mount, and that's your own choice if you want to. I personally just like having it this way. Once again, once you have your scope fully on your rifle, go ahead and position it so that your eye relief is right and your reticle is leveled. Once you have that in the right spot, push this ring until it meets up right against the front ring. That way, you'll always have it return to that point when you pull it back into battery. Go ahead and tighten up this screw. Not too tight. Finger tight, maybe 5 inch-pounds of pressure. It doesn't actually need to take much of the recoil. It just needs to survive however much force you're going to pull it back with. And as long as you're not mistreating your scope, that's not going to be too much force. As you can see here, just a little bit of tightening, and it's already doing all right. Now I'll take this off and go ahead and try a different setup on a different scope. The sliding lock ring that was just used looks very similar to our other sliding lock ring. This is the 17 SLR and this is the 18 SLR. It stands for 1/7 of an inch sliding locking ring and 1/8 of an inch sliding locking ring. The 1/7 of an inch is the same diameter as the locking collar and fits with this front ring, which is a Posa cut base. On the other hand, this front ring uses a crescent cut base and has a plunger up top that fits the 1/8 of an inch sliding locking ring. If you have a different front ring that has a different size trough or plunger, you could use one or the other of these and shave it down to be the appropriate height or width. The beauty of these old scopes is that if you have a Dremel or some sandpaper or maybe some files and some time, you can usually make a lot of cool alterations. This front ring was originally intended to go on the Unertl style scope, and for that reason it has the 1/8 inch fitting for that plunger. If you had a spare piece of brass and some machining tools, you may be able to make other plungers to fit other sizes, or use any of these sliding locking rings to fit any number of other front rings that you might already have. Because of this rail here, we call the Pope rib, this scope is not suitable for use with this front ring. Technically, the scope could be installed upside down, and the Pope rib could fit in this trough. However, because this trough is wider, and this Pope rib is a little too tall, it won't fit quite right and will wobble side to side. So it is recommended that this scope does not get used with this front ring. Instead, this fits right onto here without needing either of the sliding locking rings. If you're going to use this front ring with any of the other Malcolm scopes, you certainly can, provided you use the 18 SLR if you want it to slide. Otherwise, you could always use other sorts of locking rings to prevent the scope from sliding. However, allowing the scope to slide under recoil, as is the way the scope is put together in the normal kit, will help prolong the life of the scope. Let's go over now how to install this front ring onto both the Unertl style scope and the Malcolm smooth tubes. The Unertl scope has a reticle that is held in place on a frame that sits inside the scope tube body. This particular collar right here has two screws that hold that inner reticle frame in place. In order to slide the rings on and off of this Unertl scope body, this ring needs to be removed, which unfortunately leaves the reticle loose inside. Whenever you're going to do work on your scope that requires you to remove or install rings, please make sure that the scope is upright during the entire time so that the reticle does not slide out and break on the ground at your feet. Unfortunately, the camera as it's positioned now probably won't record this very well, so I'm just going to talk you through it as I do it. First step is to remove the two screws on the side of that little locking collar and remove that from the scope body. After that, you can slide this front ring right onto the scope tube. I like to take one extra step. I like to remove the plunger completely from the ring. Now technically, you can leave this in and install it and it'll work perfectly fine. However, the entire time that you're sliding this down the scope tube, this plunger will be dragging along the finish at the top of your scope. Over time, your scope is going to show some wear and tear. But I personally like to let that happen more naturally as opposed to causing it myself when I install the ring. Either way, it'll go on just the same. Now, in order to be able to turn the scope, I'm going to go ahead and put this collar back in and tighten up one screw, and then talk to you about the next step on this particular scope. Now the frame is back in place, the front ring is in place, and all I have to do at this point is drop the plunger onto that Pope rib, then put the spring and cap back in place. And please realize there is a lot of spring pressure here, so make sure to work out your fingers before you try this at home. I'm not going to finish tightening this in place, but if you were to be keeping this front ring on at this point, just make sure to lock that down fully. the scope is now able to slide under recoil, but realize that this setup does not have this same sort of stopping point that is found in either of these sliding locking rings. Instead, we're going to need to put our own stopping point in place. That is done with these sorts of locking rings. These are typically only used on the Unertl style scope, as it's the only situation where they're really needed. So let's go over how these go onto this scope, with the full understanding that these scopes can fit these. There's just really no need. Once again, to remove this front ring, I'm going to go ahead and take this collar off, and I'll go ahead and cut it out of this portion of the video because I figure you've seen it already. Now we're set up with the front ring installed and the tube locking collar in place. Once again, once you have your scope on your rifle and you have both your rings installed, go ahead and position it so that your eye relief and everything else is in the right position. Push this locking collar up against the front ring and just tighten it in place. This is now where your scope will be when it returns to battery, and you pull it back for each shot. One other change, typically not allowed in competitions, is the addition of a spring. This spring, when combined with another locking collar back here, allows your scope to return itself to the battery position after each shot. You fire, the scope moves forward, and then it gets pushed back into place. Competitions typically don't allow this, but if you want to make your life a little easier when you're practicing, or if you're not taking part in a competition, there's no reason why this can't be installed pretty easily. This spring has two little cutouts on it so that it can fit over the rail, and all you need to do is line those up. The rear portion has a little set screw to help lock it in place, and I will often include another locking collar behind it just as a sort of backup to prevent any accidental sliding. This front end is able to slide on its own, so it just needs to be fitted over the rail to make sure that it slides in the proper orientation. We can put this spring on the other scopes, although I don't know if anyone else out in the field has already done that. We're going to try that out in this video though and make sure there's enough clearance for it. I'm now going to go ahead and remove all the parts from this scope so that I can move them over to another one. And once again, I'm going to remove this locking ring when I'm doing that and put it back on before I tilt the scope over like it is now. A brief note. While all of the Malcolm scopes will have an eyepiece and an eyepiece locking ring that needs to be removed for the other rings to be put on and taken off, the Unertl is the only one with the replaceable reticle that will require you to be concerned about putting on and taking off this collar and keeping the scope upright. The other Malcolm scopes, the reticle is fixed in place and you can tilt it any which way without fear. Another note about the spring: because this is built to fit on the Unertl style scope, the little trough that is cut here is meant to fit the 1/8 inch rail. If you have a 1/7 inch rail or any other size, technically you could cut these out to be just a little bit wider and fit the rail. But that's something you would have to have the tools to do, and again is part of the fun of these old scopes. For now, because I don't want to try machining this, when I install this on a scope that is not the Unertl, I'm going to go ahead and use the 1/8 inch sliding locking ring, which will mean that I'm going to use the crescent cut front ring that is typically found on the Unertl scope and the 6-power two-tone. I know it sounds a little convoluted, but depending on what parts you already have, as long as you follow in order, you can figure out which parts you might need. For example, if you have a Unertl style scope, and you pick up one of these scope tubes and want to move it into your currently existing rings, then you'll know that you just need the 1/8 inch sliding locking ring. If for some reason you have a scope that has a thicker rail and you want to get rings for it and give it the ability to slide, then you know that you would need the older style Malcolm front ring, and it is capable of sliding. So take a look at the equipment you already have, and if you have any questions, make sure to give us a call. So now I'm going to go ahead and fit the Unertl style front ring and the sliding locking ring onto this old Malcolm scope in much the same way that is configured in these 6-power 2-tone scopes. And once again, I like to keep this portion towards the front. That way, whenever I pull the scope back into battery, it meets this nice, even face and is repeatable every time. On my 4570 with 405 grains of lead coming out at about 1,328 feet per second, and for those of you that shoot those kinds of rifles, you know that amount of recoil, you can see that the scope slides about 3/4 of the way of this tang. If you have something with a little stronger recoil, it might end up touching the back here, but by then most of the force of the recoil will have dissipated. This spring, once again, fits over this 1/8 inch tail, as does this plunger here. In order to put this on the rifle, I'm going to treat this front ring the same way that I treated it for the Unertl scope. Step 1 is to take out the plunger so it doesn't scrape along the scope tube the entire time. And like how we installed the sliding locking ring for this other front ring, we're going to make sure that the tail is held in here so that both can go on the scope tube without interfering. Slide them on like so. Drop your plunger in, making sure that it's aligned to fit on that little rib, and put the spring in place. I'm not going to tighten this down because I'm going to have to remove it again in a minute, but there you go. Once you have your scope and your rings set up on your rifle, once again go ahead and get it positioned, get your eye relief set, level out your crosshairs, then push the ring to meet up against the front ring. This is now where your scope will be whenever it returns to battery. After that, tighten up the screw that goes through down here, and you're good to go. I'm going to take this off part way so that we can also try out the spring. To make my life easier, I'm going to take these off most of the way, and now I realize that I left the plunger in, but that was honestly because I've done this so many times this morning that I totally lost track. So, as you can see, it really doesn't do much. Now I'm going to fit the spring over here and slide it all back onto the scope tube. Follow the same system you had used before to set your eye relief and lock in this sliding locking ring, and follow the same steps that we used for the Unertl scope to set up this rear locking ring. Now, under recoil, the scope should return just like it would on the Unertl. However, this seems like a bit of a tight fit to me. I personally would not use a spring in this situation, just because, well, it's kind of a lot of fun having to take your time and pull the scope back. Gives you a moment to stop and think about each shot. But it fits. So if you want to try out that setup, feel free. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove all of the different parts. And there we go. those parts would fit on this scope in exactly the same way. Next up, let's talk about the rear rings, the ones where the adjustments are actually made. These three rings all have the crescent cut cross bolt and will use this side of the block. This is the older style Malcolm rear ring that is found on these older 3 and 6 power Malcolm scopes. Those will use the Pazza cut side of the block. And once again, you can just flip these around if you decide to install them with the windage on one side, or if you have a different ring, what have you. Because the adjustments are built into the rings themselves, placing the rings at different distances apart from each other will cause the adjustment values to be different. Placing the rings 7 1/4 inches apart keeps them at the standard that is typically found on the 1903 and other rifles, and as such, it's what we've built the index lines on here to commonly refer to. For example, when these competition-style mounts are mounted 7 1/4 inches between the front and rear rings, each click is a 1/4 MOA. Same for these Lyman-style mounts. And because these are clickless, you'll just have to pay attention to the actual index lines themselves. If, on the other hand, the rings are mounted closer, the index values become larger. For example, at about 5.4 inches apart, they become 1/3 of an MOA. If, on the other hand, you mounted them farther apart, let's say 9 inches or 9.5 inches, that becomes 1/5 of an MOA. But for easier math, I personally like to keep them at 7 1/4 apart. All of these rear rings will fit onto all 4 of the Malcolm scopes without any sorts of adaptations or changes needed. Instead, all you'll need to look at is, if you have existing blocks, what type of cut it has, Pazza or crescent, or if you're going into competition, whether they'll allow clicks or won't allow clicks. On the other hand, if you have a particular style or version that you want to set up, then you may simply go by visual appeal. All of these are installed on the scope in exactly the same way. Simply slide them on, and then tighten your block in place. I also like to go ahead and install all these rings the same way. Because this plunger is meant to keep the scope tube pressed tight up against the bottom of these turrets, I like to remove it when I'm installing it so that it doesn't scrape along the length of the scope body as it's being put in place. Once it's in place, I just drop the plunger and the spring right back in, and you're good to go. And please keep in mind, these springs are very sturdy, so you'll want to work out your fingers before you go ahead and try this at home. Now you can make your adjustments, and if the scope is meant to slide, it can slide just fine. And once again, any of these can fit on any of the Malcolm style scopes without any changes needing to be made. I would not recommend trying to fit all 4 on at once, but if you wanted to make an unusual art piece, it wouldn't be unwarranted. These rear rings don't require any sort of locking collars or sliding locking rings or anything else really, so just position them wherever they need to be. Keep your windage on the side that's convenient to you, and make sure that your block lines up with the cross bolt in the right way. You should be good to go. This Unertl style scope doesn't have any sort of pope rib back here. So as long as you keep an eye on your reticle frame locking collar, any of these mounts can work on the Unertl style scope without any sort of interference. This tube is the same as this tube in all regards. I'm slipping this in at the end only because I realize I forgot to talk about it. Each of these tubes can very easily be leveled just by rotating when the locking ring is loose. The Unertl style scope, because it has a pope rib already built in, can't really be turned in the same way to level out the reticle. Instead, to level it out, loosen but don't remove the screws that are attaching this locking frame, and twist the frame in order to get the reticle leveled out. There's a bit of space that allows it to move in order to level out. You can't rotate it a full 360 degrees, but we find that this is plenty enough to level out the reticle when installing it on the 1903 rifle. Once you have your reticle in place and it's all leveled, just go ahead and tighten those screws back in and you're good to go. If you need to replace your reticle, or if you'd like a customized reticle, give us a call or give Mike Sexton over at Iron Sights Inc. a call as well. We'll try and help you out as best we can. I hope this has answered all of your questions about which of these Malcolm parts will fit onto which of these Malcolm scopes. And, once again, aside from the sizing difference of this front ring, just about any of these parts can fit onto any of these scopes for almost any reason at all. You only need to decide what features you do and don't want, and what pieces are already attached to your rifle that you're trying to adapt your scope for. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call. I'll be following up this video in the future with a look at our no machining mounts. I mentioned earlier that these are typically drilled and tapped into the barrel or receiver, but for a lot of the vintage rifles, people often don't want to do that. In order to help accommodate this, we've made specialty mounts that can fit blocks like these onto existing rifles without any changes being needed. Each particular rifle is going to be a little different, so to check whether or not our mounts will fit onto your rifle, don't hesitate to give us a call. And you should be looking forward to that video in the near future so I can give you all a visual example of the same thing. All I need to do is buy about 20 more rifles. If you've got some rifles to donate, please don't hesitate to call. I will definitely take them. Alright, I hope this has helped you out. Everyone have a fun day out there and make sure to enjoy whatever it is that you're getting up to at home. I'm about to get involved in a few projects, so looking forward to the next video where we try out a few more Malcolm adaptations. Take it easy.